days, I have become interested in my family history. Most family names come from a farm generations back. Agriculture has from the old times been regarded as the most important industry and employed most people. To find the origin of my family name, I have to go back 200 years. I have inherited the family name Auglend after my father John Peter. My grandfather Nils Kveilberg. My great-grandfather Peter Simeon. And my great-great-grandfather Ole Pedersen Auglend. Ole Pedersen Auglend was the first to use the name Auglend and can be called my ancestor. Ole's father, Peder Solomon Hodden, grew up on the farm Hodden on Jæren. During the war against Sweden in 1807 to 1814, two of his brothers were deployed to war service, and it was necessary to have Peder back on the farm. An agreement was made with Chef of Horsemen at Auglend, who had the right to keep horsemen exempt from war service. Peder was reported as a horseman at Auglend, but he remained at Hodden until the authorities discovered the bypass. When he was about to be discharged, he had to move in haste to Auglend. After a few years he was engaged to the 14-year-old widow Ingeborg, who had two children. In 1814 he married her, took over her farm and became chief of horsemen. They had two children, Ole and Torja. Peder did not like the farm. He was anxious that eldest stepson Tor, who was 10 years older than his own son Ole, should take the farm on farm right when he turned legal. He therefore in 1819 bought the right of tenancy for the half the farm Auglend, in the municipality of Hetland, which is now part of Stavanger. Peder changed his name to Auglend when he moved there. He was a quiet, honest and religious man who performed as a singer at funerals. His son, Ole Pedersen Auglend, was in his youth at sea for 3 summers. He took over the farm after his father Peder with his brother Torja in 1842 for 700 specidals and conditions. This year Ole married Taletta John's daughter Stokka. The brothers shared the farm, but Ole retained the main courtyard. In 1850 the Auglend farm was divided into 4 parts, and the users had become self-owners. Ole now owned Area B with utility number 4. He rebuilt the main building in 1852, and it remained unchanged for over 100 years. Taletta and Ole had 8 children at 2-year intervals: Peter, John, Justine, Olaus, Ludvig, Elizabeth, Tomine, and Olava. There were hard times with a lot of trouble, and the children had to take part in the farmyard from an early age. It was to care for sheep, pigs and chickens, as well as sowing, weeding and harvesting crops. The eagle stone is a moving stone that marks the border between the farm's bishop, Ullenhaug, and Auglend. This cultural heritage was sadly demolished by the Norwegian Public Roads Administration in 2014. Ole and Taletta were enterprising farmers who ran the farm Auglend up to more than double. In 1865 the farmer Ole Auglend had 2 horses, 7 cows, 20 sheep and 1 pig. He had many other jobs such as cage maker, manager of salt mill, member of the municipality council and commissioner for the poor. Ole helped friends and neighbors with joints and contracts. He was also the priest's assistant and a distinct missionary. The eldest son, Peter Simeon, was to inherit the farm. According to the family tradition, Peter was a school teacher after he was confirmed. He found teaching more interesting than working on a farm. With his father's approval and support, he started 20 years old at Store Teacher Seminar in 1863 and stayed for 2 years. In 1866 he moved to Sandnes and was hired as sole teacher at the school with approximately 150 students. Peter rented rooms in this house when he came to Sandnes. In addition to being a teacher, he was municipal treasurer from 1869 to 1873. Peter then started a new career. He was employed as the managing director of the newly established Gans Pottery and Brickworks. Peter ran this company well. In 1910 it had 50 workers and an annual production of approximately 2.3 million brick and tile and pottery products. In 1873 Gans Pottery and Brickworks bought this guest house as a residence and office. The census of 1875 shows that his sister Justine also lived here, as his housekeeper. 2 years later he married, 34 years old, with Maren Gveilberg. They had 5 children, Talet in 1878, Nils 1880, Olaf 1884, Inger 1886 and Sfor in 1889. The opening of the railway to Stavanger in 1878 made great changes in Sandnes. There was a battle between the city and the railroad on level crossings. Auglend was working hard to get a railway crossing north of town. The city council had advocated this crossing that several companies needed. The city won the fight in 1892 after battling for 17 years. Peter Auglend was interested in the development of the textile industry in Sandnes. He was one of the leading founders of Sandnes Uldva Fabrik in 1889 and he was a member of the first board. The factory was built on a fulfilled area in the harbour. In 1876, Sandnes Sparebank was established. Peter Auglend was among the 64 citizens who had subscribed and paid deposits to the primary capital. At the inaugural meeting, he was elected as the first deputy member of the board and quickly became its chairman. In 1889, the bank bought a house located by the town square. A few years later, Auglend proposed the idea of a bank building and it was decided to buy a site that was offered. A construction committee of 5 men, with Auglend as chairman, was formed. In August 1895 the new building was ready. The bank, shown on the right, had a bank room, municipal room and telephone exchange station on ground floor, as well as a festival room and public library. Peter Auglend was a strongly engaged citizen, member of the presidency and from 1889 mayor of the city. He held the position of managing director of Gans Pottery and Brickworks until 1916, when he was 73 years old. It was probably because of this position he was drawn so strongly into other industrial activities, in municipal work and other things that required and tempted an active man. Peter Auglend's life and work coincided with the tremendous growth in Sandnes town. He was one of the men who contributed to and led the development from the 1870s. At his death it was claimed that in the 1880s-90s, there was hardly anyone in Sandnes who to a large extent helped to create life and touch in his city like Peter Auglend. He died in 1927, 84 years old. After Peter left home, 18-year-old John was next to inherit the farm. He worked on the farm with his father Ole. Justine was born in 1847. She had versatile work on the farm. But 23 years old she was employed as a housekeeper for her brother Peter in Sandnes. A few years later she married the 7-year younger Martin Johannes Larsson. He was a farmer and owner of Part 3 of Auglend. Justine was active in a sewing club for income to the Sami people in northern Norway. The Finnair Mission was formed in 1888 to do missionary work and social work for the Sami people. They had 4 children, Olaf, Lars, John, and Martin. Justine died in 1931, 84 years old. Martin Johannes died a year earlier. They are buried in Hinne Cemetery. Their youngest son Martin became the last generation farmer on Auglend. In 1901 he started in first class and had a long school road to the prayer house Nazareth in Hilvag. After his school days Martin took courses at the Winter Agricultural School at Hinne. Here was also the only store in the immediate area at that time. Martin did his national service at Madlamone. When Martin was 25 he took over part of the father's farm at Auglend. He had 10 to 12 cows for milk production. Martin eventually got many animals and he liked to take the best at exhibitions. Over the years, he received prizes for prime horses, cows and oxen. During the war Martin got 200 Germans as close neighbors in connection with the anti-aircraft guns the Germans built on the Auglend Hill. He also had to give 2 shelters to German officers. He had to grow grain and potatoes according to the orders of the Germans, and he had to sell his agricultural products to the Germans. He also had to do guard and shuttle service for them. Martin sold his first house property months before the war and continued after the war ended. He ran his farm until the early 1960s. By then he had sold most of his farm to family houses. Here Martin stands in front of the shop, which used to be his farmhouse. He has built the fine stone wall and for that he received a gold medal. Martin died in 1992 at the age of 98. Difficult times in the late 1860s led to emigration from many farms. In 1871, brothers Ole and Louis went to America to seek happiness. When the brothers arrived in America, they changed their surname to Tagland. They settled in Rushford, Fillmore, Minnesota. After 3 years in Rushford, Ole was asked by his parents in 1874 to return to Auglend to help at the farm. The year before, the sister Tomine had died of pneumonia just 15 years old. His father Ole was now 60 and ran the farm with the second oldest son John, 29 years old. Ole married Berthina Kveilborg in Hetland Church in 1876. The mother, Tarletta, died in 1876, 60 years old. Only 4 years later, her son John died of gout fever, making difficult times on the farm. The father Ole Auglend died in 1881 of pneumonia, 67 years old. He had been a very active man throughout his life and had not had time to lie ill for more than 4 or 5 days at the end. Elizabeth and Hendrik Kveilborg married in Hetland Church in 1880. They managed the Auglend farm after Ole Auglend died. Endre was a carpenter and known for being a neat man who did a good job with the farm. Elizabeth and Endre had 5 children: Ole, Andreas, Erling, Berta, and Tomine. Ole took over half of the farm with the old houses. After a year, he sold his share to his sister Elizabeth. In 1871 Olava was 20 years old and lived on the farm. She had lost her mother, father, sister and brother. The farm was to be taken over by sister and husband. She had a brother in America and one who had told he would return. She thought the future of the farm was a bit uncertain, so she traveled to Rushford, Minnesota where Louis lived. Berthine and Ole got 3 children, Talette, Ollie, and Andrew. In 1883, after 9 years at Auglend, they traveled to America. According to farm papers of 1906, the farm consisted of about 910 acres cultivated inland and 30-40 acres that can be grown. The farm had 2 horses and 15 cattle. Separately fenced out fields were estimated at 100 acres conveniently located, but insufficient for the farm's animals. This picture was taken in 1920. Trees and shrubs could not stand in peace. Cows, juveniles and sheep ensured that most of the growth was exploited. Most people burned peat. The old stone walls divided the cultural land between the users. There is harmony over the lines. In 1908, the Auglend farm was taken over by Elizabeth's oldest son, Ole Auglend, born in 1884. In 1909 Ole married Martha Vegrestad in Hetland Church. Martha and Ole got a son, Endera, and 4 girls: Maria, Elizabeth, Astrid, and Tordis. In 1912 he took the winter agricultural school with good grades. Ole kept a detailed account of the farm in a bill of exchange. Here are a few pages of the year from June 1910 to June 1911. Originally this was just a small pond lying on the Auglend farm. It was surrounded by marshlands and heather fields. In 1915, Hetland municipality bought the pond and the area around to build a waterworks. The pond subsequently proved to be a poor investment. The water tasted bad and the waterworks were shut down. Ole's tax note for 1917 and 18 shows that he had a fortune of krona 22,500 and an income of 2,300. Taxable income calculated at krona 290, giving 33.60 in tax to the treasury. In 1936, Ole Auglend was a member of Hetland School Board. Early in the 1950s, the Auglend farm had 10 cows, 2 horses and 100 chickens. Almost the entire farm was expropriated by the municipality of Stavanger in the 1960s. Endera, the son, could only keep the plot on which the main house stood and a plot outside. When Endera died in 1974, Ole's daughter son, Olav Jorpeland, bought the house and garden. Auglend is now a large modern residential area. Olav Jorpeland and his wife live today in the original, but modernized the main house from the Auglend farm. Most Norwegian immigrants to America in the mid-1800s went to Canada, but they did not settle in the country. In the period from 1850 to 1870, Quebec was much larger than New York as a gateway for immigrants. 18-year-old Ludwig wanted to try his luck in 1871 and traveled with the sailing ship Undine from Stavanger on April 27 and arrived in Quebec on June 11. It was a long and dangerous crossing. The emigrants themselves had to bring their own equipment on board the sailboats, such as mattresses, bedding and supplies. The supply was to last for 12 weeks and usually consisted of sour milk, beer, flatbread, salted bacon, dried meat, potatoes and grits. The travelers had to cook the food themselves in simple pits on the deck or in small cookhouses. They got water and firewood from the crew, but it was rationed. Captain Thorson had a crew of 17 and 332 passengers, as well as a berth on the trip. Several of the passengers had a fever disease and the ship had to stay in quarantine for 6 days before it could anchor in Quebec. Ludwig did not have a specific goal for the journey, but he became friends with some youngsters on board and invited them to accompany them. The journey continued by train or canal boat towards the Midwest states of the United States where Norwegians had settled. They ended up in Rushford, Fillmore, Minnesota, a small settlement with just over 1,000 inhabitants. Rushford was too small to get lost in. A few elongated avenues and streets crossed at 90 degrees. Several nice parks and trees grew along some of the streets. There were some farms outside the city. At home in Stavanger, the mother Taletta was concerned about the youngest son's fate in the United States. She persuaded the 3-year-older brother Olaus to travel to see if everything was fine. He traveled with the steamship St. Olaf from Bergen on September 13, 1871 and arrived on New York on September 29, a crossing that took 16 days. Olaus came to Rushford and found that Ludwig had settled down and was employed by Thomson and Norem's Food and Trade. Olaus was used to farm work and was probably employed at one of the farms in the village. After 3 years in Rushford, Olaus was asked by his parents in 1874 to return to Auglend to help in the farm. The sister Tomine had died just 15 years old. The mother, Taletta, died in 1876, 60 years old. Just 4 years later, his brother John died of gout fever, and then his father Ole Auglend in 1881, 67 years old. Olaus married Bertine Gveilborg and worked on the farm for 9 years. In 1883 they traveled with 3 children, Talette, Ollie, and Andrew, back to America with the steamship Sarnia. The crossing from Liverpool in England to Quebec in Canada took 13 days. Conditions on board the steamers were not much better than in the sailing ships. The food on board was poorly measured and tasted bad. The emigrants were housed together in rooms with 300 bunks. The contamination was great in the number of cramped and unclean on board the boats. Deaths were not uncommon. Back in Rushford they got a child, Birdie. Bertine died in the spring of 1884, only 33 years old. A sad Olaus was left with 4 toddlers. Olaus teamed up with Christian Paulsen in the slaughtering business, the new meat market. One and a half years later, he married widow Anne-Marie Jensen in Rushford Lutheran Church. She was born in Nannestad in Norway and came 21 years old to the USA. In 1875 she married Christian Kopperud and they had 3 children, Minnie, Jenny, and Alfred. Christian Kopperud died at young age in 1882. Anne-Marie and Olaus Tagland got 4 children, Olga and Marie, who died as children, and Oren and Vivian. They lived in Rushford for the rest of their lives. Olaus bought out Paulsen in the butcher shop, and changed its name to Standard Meat Market. In 1897 he built an ice house for the preservation of meat. It was powered by a steam engine that was replaced with a petrol engine shortly thereafter. In front of the butcher shop, an awning was mounted that could be swept up or down. It received a lot of attention from the customers and gave status to the store. There were many stagecoach routes through Rushford. This is the Rushford Wagon and Carriage Company from 1872. The town had several hotels. In 1897 Olaus bought Norsk Hotel, which he ran for 3 years before selling to his daughter Taletta and son-in-law Andrew Lundblad. It was later known as the City Hotel. The hotel had served Norwegian travelers for 40 years before it was closed down in 1908 and a public auction was held of all household items. Olaus Tagland's family was photographed in 1900. The family Bible is on the table with the parents Olaus and Anne-Marie on each side. The youngsters in the front, Vivian on the left and Oren on the right. In the row from the left is Ollie, Talet, Andrew, Minnie, Alfred, and Birdie. In 1901 Ole retired, 50 years old, and sold the shop to his son Andrew and Peter Auglend. 5 years later, Auglend retired and Andrew ran the shop alone until 1925. Ole and Anne-Marie were committed and respected members of the local community. Ole was very concerned with local politics. He was a member of the city council and the Lutheran Church. In 1935, the couple celebrated a large 50-year gold wedding with 32 guests. 2 years later, Anne-Marie died 85 years old. In recent years, Ole was well taken care of by his daughter, Talet, who had left her home to live with her father. Ole celebrated his 90th birthday, January 3, 1940, with relatives and friends in his modern home. He was one of Rushford's highly respected residents and a pioneer in the business life. Ole died in the summer of 1941, 91 years old. He is buried with his wife at Rushford Lutheran Cemetery. When Ludwig came to Rushford in 1871, he immediately got employment with Thomson and Norem's Food and Trade. Almost 8 years later he married 19-year-old Ingeborg Norem, the daughter of the boss. They had 4 children, Leah, Cora, Judith, and Olive. Father-in-law Lars Norem went to his hometown of Stavanger in 1884 and died there. Ludwig became the sole owner of the business. In 1899 he erected a 2-story brick building as a replacement for the old wooden building that had become too small. Ole's butcher shop was in the neighboring building and together they installed gas lights both indoors and outdoors. After 25 years of trading, 50-year-old Ludwig sold his business and retired. He brought his 19-year-old daughter Cora with him on a long trip to Norway to meet relatives. On August 29, 1903, they traveled back through Liverpool and New York with the steamship Majestic. Pensioner Ludwig was active in a discussion club together with the most affluent residents of Rushford. He was also among the original shareholders of the First National Bank of Rushford. When he returned from the trip to Norway, he was offered to be a cashier in the bank, a position he had for 15 years. When he retired, he became director of the bank, a position he had until he died. In June 1921 Ingeborg and Ludwig held a large anniversary dinner with relatives and friends on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Tagland brothers' arrival in Rushford. Norwegian and American flags and many speeches with memories of the pioneering time. Patriotic talks about America as the land of opportunity. One of the guests recalled a story when he was assistant in Ole's butcher shop during his youth. Ludwig was an active member of the Lutheran congregation throughout his life. He taught at Sunday school, took care of the church's finances, and participated in most of the church's activities. Ingeborg was also active in the church work and had several positions of trust. Louis died in 1934, 81 years old, while Ingeborg lived until 1946 and became 86 years old. They have a common burial ground at Rushford Lutheran Cemetery. Here also lies their firstborn, Oren, who just turned 1 year old, and their youngest daughter Olive, who lived until 1981, 89 years old. Olava was born in 1861 and came to Rushford 20 years old. She married Theodor Spand in 1887 and they had 8 children, Sophia, Oren, Francis, Nora, Olga, Gerard, Judith, and Lulu. They lived in the small village of Pebble, Fillmore, with a few hundred inhabitants. Theodore was a serious, dominant and demanding father. He was heavily engaged in the leadership of the local Lutheran congregation and had many positions. The pastor had to treat him with caution as he could be angry. Olav died in 1909, 48 years old, and was buried at C Lutheran Cemetery in Mabel.